it was gone.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started with the day. I know I saw people, I thought they were coming over here.
They are.
Just slowly.
Well, that's evident.
Yeah. Good morning, and welcome to another meeting of the Georgia House Science and Technology Committee. We have a few others coming. At least they led me to believe they would be coming. This morning our presentation is going to be by Danielle Ian. Or did you pronounce that? Oh, I got it right. Okay. And Danielle, I'm not sure that's global approach, but she is a lead person on geographic information systems. And we look forward to your presentation. And if you would, come up, take the mic. You want to do it from over there, in the middle, wherever. Okay?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I always like to talk about GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and geospatial technology, so I'm excited to be here and share one of my favorite subjects with you all. As mentioned, I am with the Georgia Technology Research Institute. I think that was mentioned in the agenda. And manage the program there called GIS at GTRI. And just to give you some more context of what I bring to this presentation and what I can bring to future discussions, if you all are interested, is I represent the National States Geographic Information Council, which is a group of geographic information officers from all the states in the country. Not all the states in the country have a GIO, or a Geographic Information Officer, but we're all represented under this umbrella organization. And I'm a board member and have been for 4 years of the National States Geographic Information Council. Also, I chaired the Georgia Geospatial Advisory Council, which was new legislation passed in 2010, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And former president of Georgia ERISA, which is a nonprofit educational group for geospatial practitioners, GIS specialists and professionals. So I'd like to talk to you today about GIS, Geographic Information Systems, basically what they are, and maybe by way of doing that, what they aren't. Give you some local examples of very mature, coordinated GIS programs in the state of Georgia. Georgia itself doesn't have a very coordinated GIS program, and that's something else I'd like to point out today, but could, because we've got a lot of talent in the state. Talk to you about why geotechnologies matter, if it isn't apparently obvious. Also, I'd like to address a gap in understanding about geographic information systems, because I've talked with several leaders around the state and outside of the state, and often there is a perception of what the technologies are and what they can do versus what is necessary to enable the technology to do what it is capable of. I will address geotechnologies for more effective policy making, because I think that would be of particular interest to you guys. Highlight some geospatial coordination in other states and what is good going on in the state of Georgia. And then address the geospatial workforce and the educational arena. I have guests here today, actually, who would also like to talk with you. This is Dayton here from, currently he's at Chestatee High School, but he did a project last year in 8th grade at the Da Vinci Academy, where he used GIS in his study. So I'd like for him to share with you how he can use the technology and how all K through 12 students could be using this technology in any area of interest, any subject matter. And then I'd like to leave you with, what the opportunities for Georgia are. Pardon. So just so we're all kind of on the same page, geospatial, when I say geospatial information, or if I say geospatial technologies, or if I say geotechnologies, I'm sorry, it's my area of expertise, and there are so many terms that we throw around loosely, and I know it's confusing for people who aren't as familiar with that industry, like what's this, what's the difference between this and that. I'm kind of just speaking synonymously. GIS, geospatial technologies, geotechnologies, they all relate to location-based information. So we were talking a minute ago with the chairman about satellite imagery, satellites that are up in the sky capturing images of the Earth. That's a type of geospatial technology and a type of geospatial product. When you have a GPS, on your phone or in your car or otherwise, that's a sensor and it's receiving location-based information. That's a type of geospatial technology. Photography, environmental, political, cultural, recreational, demographic information, these all have location components and can be considered geospatial data if they are geospatially enabled. Printed maps, digital models, even Excel spreadsheets can be considered geospatial products if, again, they've been enabled by the technology so that you can visualize the data. And I'm going to show you an example of taking an Excel spreadsheet and visualizing the information in just a minute. So the power behind geographic information systems or geospatial technologies is that you can take disparate databases. So you can take an Excel spreadsheet, you can take a map, you can take an Access database, you can take, all kinds of information and tie it together using geography, even though there would be no other connection between those different databases or sources of information. So GIS connects disparate information and together to give a great picture of people, places, and policy. And it's an information integrator. That's what the technology is good at doing. And it's no longer an option, but it's a necessity. We can't just look at, our area of interest, which for the Department of Transportation might be, the transportation network. It's so important. What's the hydrography overlaid on top of the transportation network? What are the demographics? What are the municipal boundaries? All these layers of information, you have to consider all of that, not just the transportation layer, for example. So it's cross-boundary collaboration, interrelationships, planning, modeling. GIS is the technology that enables this type of visualization and geo-solutions, essentially. So again, the technology allows you to see patterns and relationships that wouldn't normally be apparent, which enables situational awareness and allows decision makers to make better decisions in a more timely fashion. Of course, and this is going to be something I kind of point out throughout this presentation, it all depends on the data. So, and that's kind of comes into play when we address the gap in understanding in GIS. I think all of you are familiar with the technologies that are available, like in real estate. You were describing how you can look at a map and you can see the houses and you can know exactly what the value is and maybe what the size of the house is, or the structure is. But what drives that application are the data behind it. And if the data aren't good, then your application isn't good. So anyway, Senator Albers contacted me last year and said, look, I've got some constituents in my area that are identifying, or they're claiming that the transportation revenue is not being spent in the same area. And he said, I've got this Excel spreadsheet, but I need to see it, and I need to see what exactly it looks like, the expenses versus the revenue. And I need to be able to share that back with my constituents. So again, in Georgia, we don't have a state cartographer. We don't have a geographic information officer. We don't have a geographic information office. So you all don't have really any central location to call and say, I need a map of such and such. These are my issues. Map them for me. So Senator Albers came to me at Georgia Tech and said, can you do this? So I did, gratis, but it's not something that we can continue to do on a gratis basis. But it's something that you all need access to. Everybody needs access to in the state of Georgia, even, especially the citizens. So we need a state map, just so people can go and look at property values and all that stuff. So I'll talk about that more. So I took his Excel spreadsheet and I produced a map for him. And it's very simple, and I'm sorry that it's kind of small, but essentially what we were able to visualize and to display easily is that the tax revenue was about $1.4 billion. The transportation expenditures were about $1 billion. So it was a 28% versus 25% split. And he was able to ease his constituents' concerns, which is that the revenue is being spent in the areas, or the expenses are being developed in the areas where the revenue is being generated. And you can actually see, if you look at the different counties, there's a blue bar graph on the top and a little orange bar graph on the bottom. That's the difference between revenue and expenditures. So you can see in Fulton County it's not as balanced, whereas in Hall County it's almost perfectly balanced. And this is very, very simple GIS, but it was an excellent way for Senator Albers to really, not only for himself see what was going on, but to communicate that back to his constituents. So I'm going to run through some Fulton County examples quickly, just to touch on all the areas that GIS is helping with their government activities. And there are plenty of examples like this from around the state. I'm only using Fulton County because they put this presentation together, and I thought it was one of the best ones that I had seen. So I know you probably can't read that, but the image is meant to relay that GIS is providing fundamental capabilities in all aspects of government activity. So Fulton County has a Geographic Information System office. Their CIO is in charge of that. They have a GIO, a Geographic Information Officer, which they call their GIS manager. But their services support voter registration, public works, state reapportionment committee, Department of Engineering with land use maps and all kinds of economic development activities, public safety. They produce police beat maps and fire response zones, map out the allocation of resources, crime hotspots. So tax assessors is a key, group that utilizes these technologies. But unfortunately, not all counties in the state of Georgia have this kind of program. And again, the state of Georgia itself does not have this kind of program. So as you can see, and this is probably typical of most counties, their revenue comes from tax more than any other source of information. And they have created a property database that is in a geospatial format. So not only do you see the property boundaries, but it's database driven. So if you click on one, you can actually, on the little bottom right hand side, you can see, you can't read it, but you could see that would identify, the number of acres, the structure on the property, the tax assessment value, whether they're current, whether they're in arrears, all the database information that relates to property ownership. So you can do queries based on these data. Do you have a question?
I do.
Go ahead.
This appears to be a subdivided area, and with meets and bounds. Are these integrated with the clerk's office that most you'll have plats that are recorded there? Is that information, and let's just use, this is Fulton County?
Yes.
Is that information transferred from what is recorded there at the clerk's office to this system here for them? Is that how they get this information?
I don't have an exact answer for you. What I can tell you, and I can get an exact answer for you, but what I can tell you is it's different from county to county. Number one, I know that is true for sure. Number two, not all clerks of court are integrating with the tax assessor's data via a database that's spatially enabled. That I know is true. Whether Fulton County is doing so or not, I'm not positive. So I can find out for you.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you.
So because Fulton County has their property owner database in a GIS format, they can query it for all kinds of information. They can, and several counties, Effingham County, for example, did this very simple but very savvy geospatial analysis a few years ago, and they said, okay, show me, because they also had their property database in a GIS format. They said, show me where all the properties are from $0 to $99,000 in value, $100 to $199,000, and they just produced a simple color map. And what they saw immediately was like there might be a yellow amongst all these blues. And they went and they did, essentially what they did was a tax audit. And they went back and they charged people, they reassessed those properties that were undervalued, which was due revenue to the county. It wasn't any penalty to anybody. Actually, they'd gotten a break for so many years by not being properly assessed. And they realized like $120,000 worth of due revenue in a year just by that simple analysis. So you can use these property databases for everything, for address, for sending out letters, to particular individuals who need to know something based, again, on place. Maybe they are near some kind of attainment, non-attainment area or whatever. And again, they use these property data for land use planning, zoning, identifying environmental factors, like the tornado that came through, a couple years ago, who's going to be impacted, what direction is the storm heading, what's the damage that the storm has done. Once you know now where your properties are, you can overlay other information like, okay, so just tell me which properties were affected by this particular event. And I'll explain that further in a minute. Infrastructure, maintaining infrastructure, this can actually be used for work order system management, so you can identify the condition of assets and then send your field crew out and say, here's the priority that you need to address these items first because they're in the worst condition. Not only that, you can use the GIS to optimize your route. So instead of hitting just 20 assets in a day or in a week and retrofitting them or fixing them, you can do it in an order that makes most economical sense via gas, distance, proximity, etc. This is all geographically and geometrically accurate information. Again, Fulton County is more mature. They have these data in their GIS. Most counties aren't as mature as Fulton County with geospatial technologies. Tracking sexual offenders is something they do well using geospatial technologies. Calls from cell phones is great because in Fulton County, as you know, there are a million roads with the same name. And then there are people who say, I need help, we're on, whatever, Smith Drive, and they may not even be in Fulton County. And it has happened frequently where a dispatcher has sent a first responder to the wrong location. And using GIS, you can actually see where the calls are coming from and whether you need to reroute that call or not. Tornado damage assessment, another example of how you can use the technology. So just to continue, if it hasn't already sunken in why geotechnologies matter, here are some statistics for you. The geospatial industry is one of the fastest growing workforces and high growth industries according to the United States Department of Labor. There are 850,000 current geospatial workers in the United States with an additional 350,000 needed by 2018. There's a 15% growth rate in new jobs projected over the next decade. It was in 2001 about a $5 billion industry, which grew to about a $30 billion industry 4 years later. And then that's broken out into like the remote sensing market, which would be the satellite imagery and the aerial photography market, and then the GIS market, which are all the people that are putting the data together and doing the analysis. About 90% of government info has a locational component. I would argue that that's a statistic you can find in most literature. There are very few, if any, items that I can think of that don't have an effect on location or don't have a locational component. Geospatial capabilities, according to the National Association of State Chief Information Officers.
I'd like to comment at a use that we had this past summer. As you probably read, we did redistrict the state.
Yes.
We used GIS
Yes.
in Lumpkin and Dawson County, where we knew the people lived, in order to divide within 50 people.
Yes. I'm glad you pointed that out. It makes a difference. Who's being represented? Are they being properly represented? Yeah. Where are the lines, the municipal district lines? When you annex a city, or an area, how do you do that? And which properties are included? And it's not unheard of for a property to be claimed by two different counties.
We had that example for about 6 years between Dawson and Lumpkin County. When the boundaries were drawn, the major markers are now in the water in Lake Lanier.
Yeah.
And so there were lawsuits between the county as to where, and it meant a lot in property taxes to whichever county was involved.
Yes.
It got worked out.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you though, it maybe that case did, but there are other cases of that around the state. We don't have in Georgia. We don't have a statewide properties database.
Now, I think there's a lawsuit now between Bibb County and what's the county directly to the north of it, over what the boundaries are. But
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So according to the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, geospatial capabilities represent a portfolio of capabilities that extend across the enterprise. Every area of government, every area of private business, actually. GIS was ranked by that same association as one of the top technologies. And there is a program called the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, and this is the federal government's quilt. They want to take state data and put together this blanket for the country all the transportation network across the United States, all the hydrography across the United States, all the property data across the United States. But because states are at different places with their development of these databases, there isn't a uniform blanket. And even if you break it down by state, if you look at Georgia, 159 counties, we're not all created equal as far as geospatial capabilities go. And I'll show you the results of that in a minute. We did an audit across the state last year and found out that so many of the counties actually can't even, they don't have their properties in a GIS database. They can't do any kind of analysis like what we're talking about here. So this slide is very important in my opinion. This point, this sentiment. Here's what I've heard, and it's crucial to communicate. Yes, the technology exists to do these kind of analyses, to overlay data on top of each other and come up with patterns. Say, show me where, you know, I can put Home Depot. They want it to be within 2 miles of an interstate. They want the demographics, the mean average to be, you know, salary to be $45,000. They want, you know, a two-way road, whatever. They need a certain soil type for their structure. Bam, 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 you can get the GIS to show you in red where all those parcels are that meet that site criteria. That's great. The technology's there to do that. If you don't have the soil types database, and if it's not accurate, or if it's not complete, if you don't have the property ownership database, and if it's not accurate, and if it's not complete, if you don't have a solid transportation network, again, inaccurate and incomplete, you're not going to get good results. So yes, the technology exists. Where we're responsible in the state of Georgia at the local, regional, and state level is in producing accurate and complete data. And that's where we're having some discrepancies. Go ahead.
This information is pretty much a picture of a flat ground. Is there the future opportunity of getting the topography?
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like you're about to answer the question.
I'm waiting.
Oh.
But I'm positive that you're asking this question.
Yes. Well, I'm positive that I would like to know, in this, is there a movement to now go to you was talking about, and I'm thinking about a commercial use of this, in maybe locating a Bass Pro Shop or a major box store. Will there be some point in time the topography will be available of that property that's being shown here?
Okay, the answer is yes. The topography across the state of Georgia is already available. 3D elevation data are already available.
Okay.
It's called elevation data, or a terrain model is another term for that. But it's not very high resolution. And if you guys don't mind, like, the hardest part for me preparing for today was making this linear presentation where I could walk you through this, but do you mind if I just skip around a little bit, because your question will take me to a later point in my slides? Okay, so let me go down here. I'm going to answer your question right now, and then I'll walk you through it for a minute. There is a terrain model for Georgia. Georgia did not develop it. We're using the model that's available through the United States Geological Survey. It's a 10-meter resolution data model. That resolution means that when you get down to the southern half of Georgia, below the fall line, where you don't have a lot of topography or a lot of relief in topography, that you won't see that on the digital model. Because the digital model, let's say, and I'm just giving you relative examples, if the digital model accuracy is like this, anywhere that you have terrain changes within here, they look flat. So, for example, the I-95 berm, the entire I-95 berm is not accounted for in the digital elevation model that we're using right now. What that means is if you do a flooding model, if you say, show me which counties are going to flood if the sea level rises X number of inches, it's going to look a lot worse than it really would be. The state of Georgia has no program, has no oversight for it. The state of Georgia needs a more accurate elevation model. Nobody's saying that on behalf of Georgia. Counties are saying that for themselves. So here's the example I was going to skip to. Again, good data versus not so good data. Not that it's bad data, it's just not as accurate. This treatment plant was placed at this location, which was outside the 100-year flood zone, per FEMA's data. This is what happened in the 2009 floods that we saw. where over $500 million of uninsured property losses were claimed just in North Georgia alone. These are people who did not have flood insurance because they didn't know they were in the flood zone, because the data showed that they were not in the flood zone. This particular plant has to relocate, and considering all other options, they have none except to relocate at $95 million cost. So let me show you another example. This is the data elevation model that we're using now. Again, it's from the United States Geological Survey because Georgia hasn't done anything proactive for itself. North Carolina, for example, which is reactive because they've had the hurricane hit, we haven't, with the exception of Albany and a couple other places around Georgia, we as a state haven't suffered like a Katrina or and if you look to those states that have had these cataclysmic disasters, they are so much more geospatially mature than we are in Georgia because of reacting to the situation. So what we have now is a 10-meter elevation model, and that's what you see in green. That's not water. That's actually what the flooding would look like per our elevation model, our terrain model, topographic model. Okay, this is in Towns County, Lake Lanier properties. Towns County paid to have a 6-inch resolution 3D model developed through a technology called LIDAR. Towns. We could do this for the state of Georgia, and I could tell you exactly how much it would cost and how we could phase it out. But the point I want to make to answer your question is what's the difference? How does this impact us or anybody who increases the accuracy of their data? So Towns County, this is what it looked like. They paid to have the 6-inch LIDAR flown to increase their elevation model, and here's the difference. Now, I'm just going to go back and forth a couple times so you can see. This is the 10-meter resolution elevation data and what flooding would look like based on that data. Here it is with 6-inch accuracy. Now, you probably can't see, there's a bunch of little homes around the shoreline that have little red outlines around them. Those are the structures that have now been removed from the FEMA flood risk requirements and no longer have to have flooding insurance. This investment that Towns County made has saved its homeowners, over 300 properties, over $1 million in 10 years in insurance premiums. So one way to look at it is how much money are people paying that don't need to be paying, but again, and I pointed this out a minute ago, how much is it costing people who don't have the insurance who need it? And so for the sake of your interest, I think, how does this affect policy? Well, last year, 2010, I'm sorry, Senator Carter proposed House Bill 169, and it passed, which was to have counties across the state produce a list of all the properties that were within the floodplain zone so they could notify property owners. Association County Commissioners of Georgia is all for that. They want property owners to be notified of impacts of their property. But they're very concerned, like, what if we notify them erroneously? In other words, what if the data are not correct? And two, and actually number one is probably, not all counties can do this easily. If you don't have the property data in a GIS format and you can't overlay it with the floodplain data, how are you going to produce that list? The data that are necessary to accomplish this policy goal would be buildings or building addresses, property boundaries, and floodplain boundaries. And then you can produce a list of properties that are potentially impacted by flood insurance rates. So for example, Newton County, which again in metro Atlanta has a very mature GIS program. I'm proud of Newton County. I live there, but they've been one of the counties that have really been advanced in this area, a lot longer than most. But here's an example. So Newton County has their property boundaries in a GIS format. That's that blue box in the middle. They have aerial photography to serve as a base reference. They have elevation data, which maybe you can't see very clearly. There's little white labels across there. Those are placed on top of contour lines. And then there's a pink band going from the top to the bottom along the middle to left-hand side of the image. That is actually FEMA's floodplain boundary for this particular area. So what you can see is Newton County has the data that they need, and quickly, like within 5 minutes, they could produce a report saying, tell me all properties that fall within a floodplain boundary, and they could do that. But there are more than 30% of the counties in the state of Georgia that could not do that because they don't have these data in this format. So that's the main point that Association County Commissioners of Georgia was making. You're putting this burden on the counties and they can't comply. But the second point, and I think for our discussion, the bigger point is if the data aren't accurate, then what? You know, and if you look at this closely, you can see a road, which is that gray line going from upper left to bottom. That's a road. The floodplain boundary, which kind of makes an X across the road, crosses the road. I mean, the floodplain boundary crosses the road. And it goes up the contour, it goes up the elevation over into the house. I mean, it's not accurate, but this is FEMA's data. FEMA's data for this area might be from 1960s. It might have been before that road ever existed. So if you don't, as a county, have this information, you can't really appeal whether the data are accurate or not. If you do, then you have a leg to stand on, and you can produce these examples and say, FEMA, you need to correct this data, blah, blah, blah. But so this is a great example of the data accuracy and completeness. Okay, so geospatial technologies drive location-based intelligence and services, so they are critical to state policy and state decision-making. Where are things happening? What's happening? When are things happening? What are the patterns? You know, how have things changed? And are we passing policies that are appropriate and reasonable? So with this bill, with the goal of this bill, Carter's bill, Senator Carter's bill, which was to have these lists of properties that fall within the floodplain zones produced, actually the bill was changed because we realized I was called into the picture as a neutral party at Georgia Tech, but ACCG and the representatives all got together and said, okay, we can't really pass this policy until we know what the capabilities are across the state of Georgia regarding GIS. So we did change the legislation, and the new intention, again with the ultimate goal of accomplishing Senator Carter's need, which is to notify property owners accurately. The new task became auditing the state of Georgia, their capabilities at the county, regional, and state levels, and making recommendations for utilizing geospatial capabilities across the state. And this is what we came up with. Margaret didn't love this map, and I couldn't change it in the amount of time that I had to produce it for you guys today, but what I want you to see is we had an 88% response rate when we did this audit last year. There was a Georgia Geospatial Advisory Council created. I chaired that council. We accomplished the 2-year mandate in 6 months. 88% of the counties responded, and if you all ever want me to run your campaigns, I will be happy to do that. So the counties in white that are kind of like just missing, those are the counties that didn't respond. And it's not that they weren't responsive or didn't want to respond, it was that they were a little hesitant about what's, you know, is the state just trying to pass some policy and put us in an awkward, so it was a little, this has never been done in Georgia before, so there was a little reservation. But 88% responded, and what you can see from the symbols there is that there's huge discrepancy as far as the capabilities. There is no minimum level of capabilities across the state. Not every county has its property database in a GIS format. Not every county has its buildings in a GIS format. Not every county can notify its citizens electronically. And that's what this map is intended to display. And I have a larger printout of it if you guys want to see it. Did you have a question?
Yes, you had referred to the fact that you could perhaps produce for us the amount of money it would take to have Georgia have a complete list of, would the counties be able to give a list to the state of Georgia, and then the state of Georgia use the county's list if their data was correct to begin a statewide GIS program, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
I think Richmond County is pretty up to date
Yes.
on that. We've spent quite a bit of money.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if the counties that have already come up to speed, if you have a particular measure that you would give, could share with the state of Georgia if and when we could actually build
Right.
such a model.
Yes.
Is that a possibility?
Definitely. And it's not just a possibility, it's happening in other states. And there are real examples of that all over the country.
Because what I see when I look at this, I see economic development
Yes.
just waiting
Yes.
to happen.
Yes.
And why in the world aren't we utilizing?
I'll point to that particular issue, but not issue, success story.
Okay.
the answer to your question is yes. Statewide GIS coordination is a collaborative endeavor. It should be something, and it has to be actually, something that local governments, regional governments, and state governments each participate in. You can weight the allocation based on need and demand, but everybody's going to benefit from these data. Develop the database once, use it multiple times. So Tennessee is an example of a state that has done what you were suggesting. They identified what it would cost to put together a statewide properties map, and for Georgia that would be about $900,000. And they got the counties to contribute to that, because to do it, it's an economy of scale. To do it one by one would have cost far more than it cost them to do it as a collaborative endeavor. So that was one of the recommendations that came out of this report. We did this audit, but we also made recommendations, and I'll show you those recommendations, one of which is to develop a statewide parcel map.
Pardon me.
Yes.
How long does Mr. Hare need?
He will be 2 minutes. And he's coming up in just a minute. Because he is, Marla said he's the highlight of today. But so because we're lacking this program, because we're lacking that umbrella vision for the state or any coordination for the, and we have coordinating bodies, so I don't mean to send the wrong message, but they're not tied into legislative decision making. This is probably one of the first times you've heard this type of presentation. We, the geospatial community, are not reporting to you all on a regular basis. We're not hearing your issues and telling you, hey, here's a solution.
You've got me wide-eyed right now. $900,000 to implement this.
There are details, okay? There are about 2/3 of the state counties have their parcel data already in a GIS format,
right?
Okay? So we could take existing data and seam it together. There are going to be problems with that, and there can be a technical report written very easily that could tell you what deliverable you would get for $900,000. But for $900,000, and this is per the University of Georgia, and they do this kind of stuff for counties all the time, help them develop their parcel database, their property database. They could fill in those gaps, and then they could seam something together. Because we don't have a geospatial information office or officer, we don't have standards. So all these counties are developing their property databases the best way they know how. This county might have 13 records in its database. This county might have 21 records in its database. When you try to reconcile those, the number of records aren't going to always match. The number of fields in the database aren't going to always match. Plus the geography is not going to always match. So it's not like Newton and Rockdale are going to line up perfectly. If one's using one projection system, map projection system, and another, it might go like this. And then you get those properties, you're like, where do they belong? But we could get something together as a starting point, as a statewide properties database.
That's the question. I just want to follow up, and then I'm done.
Yep.
I would be interested in seeing the breakdown of the cost, and what would we get for $900,000 or equivalent to that. I would like to see that.
Yeah, I can have that developed for you, I think. I'll have to talk with the GIS coordinating committee, which is kind of the technical arm of our volunteer group of people that do work, and I'll tell them that you're interested and see what they can do. And I'll get your card so I can communicate with you if that's okay.
I'll do it.
Or maybe should I do that through you, Chairman, and you can produce it for the committee? Okay. Terry, did you make a note of that? Thank you. So quickly, and then I want to move on to our highlight here. I have a lot more information. I could talk about this stuff for days. You know, we can have a follow-up meeting. But like I said, it was hard putting all this together because we could go in so many directions. But that audit, that statewide geospatial audit that we did, the 5 recommendations that we ended with are here. And you have already pinpointed them before I got to this. But one is to formalize a geospatial advisory council for the state, for you guys, you know, so that and so we can listen to the issues and help with some proposed solutions. That actually is being done today. So the House Bill 169 I mentioned that created the council was a 2-year bill, which would be sunsetting this year. But this afternoon at 3 o'clock, the Senate Natural Resources and Environment Committee is proposing House Bill 369, which is same language, just continues the Geospatial Advisory Council through 2015. So hopefully you all will support that when and if it comes your way. The second, and that's a no fee for that, you know, this is a volunteer group of people that just are passionate like me. We want to see our bring our capabilities home, to the state. Second thing was to establish a geospatial information office or program, whatever you want to call it, for the state of Georgia. And you could get this started with 2 full-time employees and about a $250,000 operating budget. These all come from the report. I have copies of the report here if anybody wants to flip through it. A third recommendation, which is currently underway, and this is thanks to EPD Director Alan Barnes, former EPD Director Alan Barnes, is to execute a statewide master agreement for software. Because all these state agencies and anybody who uses the software has to go through the whole procurement process to get it. It's not like Microsoft Office that GTA has gotten a statewide contract with, and you can just order as you need. You've got to go through a sole source or a full procurement process to access the software. So I think we've got that covered. And then the last 2 are data-driven recommendations. If the state of Georgia had a statewide parcel database and a more accurate elevation database, it is unbelievable, the economic development, the more accurate reporting, the better citizen notification, the enabled services to the citizen. I mean, it's just amazing. Those 2 databases by themselves could just enable probably more than 50% of government activities. So I have more, but what I'd like to do is stop here, turn it over to Dayton Hare, who's here to talk about how he has used the technology in his 8th grade course. Again, keep in mind, not all counties, not all school systems are created equal when it comes to geospatial technologies. Most systems in the state of Georgia, teachers won't even know what that means and what it is, and are not sharing that with their students. But here's a great example of Gainesville State College. We have Zach Miller here from Gainesville State College. Gainesville State College was a part of a consortium that got a $10 million grant from the National Science Foundation to develop a geospatial technology center for the country. Gainesville State College is the southeastern hub of that. And they have been giving grants to some schools around the state to integrate some GIS into their courses. Again, it's not a standard. It's not built into the curriculum in the state of Georgia. But here's an example of how that work was used, or that technology was used in K-12. Okay.
All right, so hello, I'm Dayton Hare. I'm currently in 9th grade at Chestatee High School in Hall County, but I'll be talking to you about a project that I did last year in 8th grade, and that was at the Da Vinci Academy, which is branched off of South Hall Middle School. Wonderful. Okay. All right. So I was taking a GIS class last year with Mr. Miller as my instructor, and during this course we wanted to have a major project that we could work on. So we came up with this question of, there was this stormwater utility fee that we knew that Gwinnett County has because everything is about moving forward and being more environmentally friendly and such. And so we wondered, what would the impact of that fee be on Hall County if it were implemented there? We decided to narrow that down some and look at the Hall County school system in particular. And so we just started with that. We got a little bit of data. We used aerial photographs from 2010 of the county, and also we got property boundaries from the school system. So using that, we were able to then construct a map that we could use to determine what the impact would be. And what we did with this is, in the red you can see the different property boundaries of the schools, and this is only one section of the schools. This is the Chestatee High School and Chestatee Middle School, as well as Sardis Elementary School area, and that's what I did, while others in the class worked on different areas. And the red is the property boundaries, and the different colors are the impervious surfaces. So what we did is, using the aerial photographs as a reference, we interpreted them, and we would digitize new data for where the impervious surfaces would be. So we also made a key so you can tell what the different surfaces are, such as the buildings, roads, parking lots, and all of that. And we tried to be as detailed as possible. For example, if you look down at the baseball field, I don't know if you can see that in the bottom right corner near the edge of the property boundary. Thank you. So we just went through and did all of that for all of the schools in the county that we could have the properties for. we did run into some difficulty with the properties not actually being named with the schools. They were just numbers, so we had to sort out what they were. But using this data, we were able to calculate, using Gwinnett County's fee as a reference, how much money the school system would need to be paying annually if this were implemented, because according to Gwinnett County, no one is exempt from this, so schools, churches, government offices, everything would be taking part. And we determined that it would be roughly $300,000, I believe, for the entire county school system annually if this were implemented. So that was the solution to our problem. So we also wanted to think about what this would be like if we did not have GIS to use. And really we think it would probably be impossible, because the sort of thing we were doing wouldn't be very easily measured by hand. We'd either have to find existing maps that were actual printouts and such and measure and calculate each individual surface, which would take, well, a very long time, longer than we had. Or we would have to go out and physically measure the surfaces ourselves, which would take even longer. It would require quite a bit more funding and quite a bit more manpower. So clearly GIS enabled us to tackle this problem much more quickly. So that is about it.
All right. I'd like to ask the question. Since we're talking about impervious surfaces, and I used to be on Natural Resources Committee, and we had all kinds of problems with the EPD because of impervious surface. Did anybody calculate the volume of water that you would probably have running off of the school property from these impervious surfaces, say?
I don't believe we did we?
No, Mr. Chairman, the idea was that we would map out the impervious surfaces, and if we continue this class in future years, that would be an extension. If we could take that data and build on to that in future years, and look at those types of questions.
Thank you. And one comment. I used to represent y'all years ago. I live in Dahlonega.
I just want to ask one question.
Correct.
Was this submitted to the county?
I actually have no idea.
You know, I still have a copy of the data, and it was all done by hand. There's automated processes to do the same thing, which is what they would use in Gwinnett County. How can it also do it automated way?
I wish this had been available back before they imposed the penalties on us in the county that I live in. It would have been very helpful. It had been tremendously helpful in cost.
I want to respond to both of those comments, if you don't mind. Number one, Chairman Amos, if you know that the algorithm that will produce the volume of water that's displaced from impervious surfaces requires knowing what the surface area of impervious is. And so coming up with this is one piece of that equation, but you can pop that into the model very easily and come up with that number. And then the second point is, yeah, all of us need a minimum level of capabilities. That's what I want, that's what the geospatial community wants to see for the state of Georgia. Why can't all counties have this base information to do not only the assessments you're talking about, but enable research? I mean, get these students, if he didn't have the property data, if he didn't have the aerial photography, he couldn't have done that project. Not just him, the whole class couldn't have done that project. I mean, we see it all the time at Georgia Tech. We've got all these like capable computer engineers and scientists, and they want to build, you know, little phone applications. But if the data aren't good, if you don't have access to them, what can you do? So you can't build the vehicle. You can build all kinds of vehicles, but if you don't have good gas, if you don't have good data to fuel it, and if you don't have good oil, good coordination, and good communication, then your vehicle can just sit there and not really perform for you the way you need it to. Thank you, Dayton. So I have a lot more, but I think I hope that I've gotten, you know, across the message of where we are in Georgia. And this is a quickie map, you know, to show you, according to the National States Geographic Information Council, there are 9 components for an effective statewide geospatial program. The lighter colored states are not mature with respect to those 9 criteria. The darker colored states are very mature with respect to those 9 criteria. You can kind of see where Georgia falls. We're lacking. Oh, yes, yes. Alabama has a geographic information officer. Alabama has this, state portal for situational awareness. Yeah. And then I wanted to leave you with some opportunities. We could be tying GIS to your issues, providing not the technology, but the geospatial solution via the technology. We could be developing critical statewide geospatial databases to enable government activities and delivery of service to citizens. And that includes, as we've talked about, property databases. But we don't have an address database for the state of Georgia. So if the human resources needs to track disease or track, health statistics, and they need to take an Excel spreadsheet and map it, they can't use our own Georgia transportation database to put points on a map to show where those addresses or where those locations are. They've got to use a third-party software. If everybody's using a different third-party software, you're going to get all kinds of different results when you go to map stuff. So we don't have an address database for the state of Georgia. We don't have higher resolution elevation database for the state of Georgia. So our models are off. Our flooding models are off.
Do you have your own model?
My
Just at GTRI that
Yes.
you're working with, you have your own models for this? Or are you having to use other third-party models to make your information?
For address,
Yeah.
to take Excel data and map it to an address, have to use a third-party service. With the exception of Metro Atlanta. So of the entire, Georgia does not have an address database, property addresses. We don't have a properties database, polygons, outlines of properties for the state. But in Metro Atlanta, where you have a lot of mature GIS programs in Fulton County, Cobb County, Gwinnett County, Newton County, Rockdale County, those addresses are available. But that's about 50% of the state.
Yeah, well, I guess my question then is, do they have a contract with all of those counties have a contract with a third party?
No.
They have their own software then?
They will probably each have a contract, or they'll be paying for services to make address points from addresses, but there's no consolidated or standard contract. So they might each be using different services.
What do you think it would cost to have a third party develop a model that could handle the whole state?
Well, here's where a geographic information officer would come in handy, because the Department of Transportation has a beautiful transportation network for the state of Georgia. They know every speed limit on every segment of road, what the material is that the road is comprised of, but it's not in their mission to capture address ranges. So for this segment of Martin Luther King, we know it goes from 300 to 600, and you could know where they are. They could be capturing that additional piece of information that would service so many other, if not all, state agencies and local governments. And it may cost a little bit more, and I don't have a number for you.
I understand.
But the return on investment would be enormous because of the utilization of that data. So I don't have that number for you. Either Georgia could contract out for one standard third-party service, so everybody's at least using the same version and getting the same results, or we could potentially identify DOT or another organization to capture addresses for the state. And there would be a fee for that, but I don't have that number right now. But if you did a statewide parcel, here's something to consider. If you did put together a statewide parcels database, you could pull the centroid of each parcel and get an address for that. And that would be, the $900,000 would be to develop the parcels database. You could get the address database as a subset of that, as a byproduct of that, for another additional fee, but it would be a lot smaller than trying to do the whole state addresses by itself. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. Thank you.
Okay. I can make this presentation available for you guys. There are more slides, because I, again, wasn't sure what direction we would go in our conversation, but that's mostly what I wanted to present to you. And do you have further thoughts or discussion?
I would like to see the rest of what you're going to present.
You have time for that? Okay.
Well,
Not-
not today.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
We
I'm not done until
You gotta
lunch.
be rules. So,
Yeah.
I'm happy to come back anytime. I'm happy to meet any of you at your offices one-on-one, whatever works best for you guys. And again, I have a lot of, I have the Geospatial Advisory Council report here if you want to look through it. I have a salary survey. I didn't talk yet, and I have it here, about the types of jobs that geospatial practitioners, the roles that they fill, the salaries that they make, what percentage are in government, what percentage are in private sector. I have a document here that's a salary survey for the nation that you can look at. I also have a really nice document, and this is not for you to keep, although I'd be happy that I can email you all this stuff so you have digital copies. We put together a package of geospatial case studies from across Georgia. So you'll see how different counties and cities are getting a return on their investment and what they're doing to use geospatial technology. And it goes from like mapping the Peachtree City golf cart, trails. But that's not just fun and recreation. That's if somebody's hurt and you need to tell first responders how to get to them, you can give them a pinpoint location and they can get there a lot faster than otherwise. So there are a lot of examples in here.
Well, if you can email that, Marlette has my address, and then I can disperse it out to the members of the committee.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Danielle, thank you very much for being with us
Yes.
this morning.
I appreciate your time.
And also with you, Dayton and Zach, really appreciate it. Any questions? This meeting is adjourned.